Welcome back to the 8th annual Halloween special. Tonight we're going to be talking about a film that I don't think gets as much credit as it deserves, and that film is The Exorcism of Emily Rose, directed by Scott Derrickson, who made Hellraiser Inferno, The Day the Earth Stood Still, Doctor Strange, Sinister, Deliver Us from Evil, and this film. And this film takes a very unique approach to the stereotypical exorcism film that we're so used to seeing. There's tons of movies that are called The Haunting of, and then a person's name, or The Exorcism of, and then a person's name, or a place, or a location. The Haunting of Molly Hartley, The Haunting in Connecticut. There's a lot of these movies. And when you hear just the title of this film, it immediately sounds like it's going to be some direct-to-DVD or VOD movie that is really bad. But this film is very different from the rest. It stands out significantly because the film mixes an exorcism horror film with a courtroom drama, and it does so to great effect. Critics did not love this film when it was initially released, but it has since developed a bit of a following, largely because people saw Sinister, went, holy shit, that was really good, went back and watched Scott Derrickson's filmography and came across The Exorcism of Emily Rose, and were surprised by the quality. This film has an incredible cast: Laura Linney, Tom Wilkinson, Jennifer Carpenter, Campbell Scott, Henry Czerny, and Colm Feore, who I'm always going to love from Storm of the Century. Side note, if you've never seen Storm of the Century, it's fucking awesome and you should watch it. It's a really good Stephen King miniseries. The Exorcism of Emily Rose is about a lawyer who takes on a negligent homicide case involving a priest who performed an exorcism on a young girl. From the very beginning of this film, it subverts your expectations. You have this lonely house in the middle of nowhere. It's very creepy. You see a barbed wire fence with blood dripping from it. The title card comes up, and now there's this man with a hat and a trench coat walking up to this house, and you assume that must be the exorcist going to visit this girl to exorcise a demon. But then you find out he's the medical examiner, and you realize the girl's already dead. The exorcism failed. It didn't work. And the priest is there, Tom Wilkinson, mourning this loss, terrified at what that could mean for himself and for this family, and mourning the loss of a girl that he cared about. And I saw this film not knowing what it was about. I had absolutely no idea, and I watched it purely because I'm a fan of Scott Derrickson. And so I was very interested immediately. I was hooked within a few minutes, because from the opening scene, you don't know where the film's going. You meet Laura Linney's character, who takes this case, because eventually, this priest played by Wilkinson is prosecuted for a negligent homicide. They're trying to send him to jail because they believe that this girl was epileptic and that she needed care, she needed medication, not an exorcism. And if they had just been able to give her the drugs that they thought she needed, she would still be alive. So the film becomes a question of faith. The defense is entirely built around the fact that you have to accept that both the girl and the priest believed she was possessed and believed they were doing the right thing and that he had consent from her and their family. Whereas the prosecution is saying, none of that fucking matters. The girl's dead. She should have been given care, not that type of care. So the film is filled with fascinating questions of faith, whether you believe in God, Satan, demons, possession, exorcism. All of that is literally on trial. And it's boosted by magnificent performances, particularly from Jennifer Carpenter and Tom Wilkinson. Laura Linney's excellent in the movie, and so is Campbell Scott as a ruthless lawyer. But Jennifer Carpenter really shines as Emily Rose, because as the court proceedings play out, you get to see the backstory. You watch how all of this came to be for Emily Rose. She contorts her body into horrific poses. She's screaming, spits flying from her mouth. She's terrifying in this movie. And Derrickson does an excellent job at making sure that the exorcism scene that eventually occurs doesn't feel like other exorcism scenes. There's a uniqueness to it. He uses handheld a lot, but not to an ugly extent. His film never looks bad. In fact, one of the things I love about this movie is his use of lighting, particularly darkness and shadows. There's a lot of horror films that tend to overlight the nighttime, to the point where characters are in a place where there really isn't any light, but somehow you can see everything. There's many sequences in this movie where Laura Linney is creeping through her apartment at 3 a.m., the witching hour, because as the priest tells her, if she takes this case, the demonic entities that surround it are going to become interested in her. So every night in her apartment, things start to move around. She hears noises. She smells something burning. So she's wandering around her apartment, and sometimes you can't even see the features of her face. The darkness and shadows in the film is very realistic, and I've always appreciated whenever a filmmaker is able to do that with their film and not rely on tons and tons of lights just to create this very visually beautiful moment that feels impossible. I also like how the court case does not feel one-sided. Every time the prosecution makes a point, it's a good point. Very rarely do they ever say something that just feels like the evil bad guys are making a case and you feel bad for the underdogs. There are plenty of moments where the prosecution will make a great point and you have to acknowledge that that is a great point. It kind of puts you in the seat of the jury, makes you question whether or not this girl or the family are insane. Maybe she really did have medical problems. And there's one specific aspect of the movie, just that opening visual, where you see a barbed wire fence and blood dripping from it. Later in the film, and I guess this could be a little spoilery if you've never seen the movie, so I just want to warn you that I will be talking a little bit about spoilers for the rest of this video. Later in the film, she claims at one point that she had stigmata, the wounds in her palms and feet. But the lawyer for the prosecution says she could have just grabbed that barbed wire fence and cut her palms. And you remember that opening shot with the blood dripping down the fence. And it puts doubt in your mind. But at the same time, she could have had the stigmata already, then grabbed the fence and got blood on it. So it's 50-50. I love that about this movie. It doesn't outright tell you this person's right, this person's wrong. It allows you to get into their heads and make up your own mind. Yeah, you tend to be on the side of the priest because you're watching a film called The Exorcism of Emily Rose, but the eventual verdict in the case doesn't get melodramatic or cheesy. And like I said, spoilers, I'm going to discuss the verdict, so if you haven't seen the movie, again, second warning. Even though Laura Linney's character was able to make this grand case for the fact that they all believed she was possessed and that the exorcism was consented and approved by all of them and it's what they wanted, the jury still finds him guilty. But they recommend that time served to be his sentence because he has spent the entirety of this courtroom case in jail already. So it's a win, but it's not a win. And just like the ongoing battle of trying to prove or disprove things that people believe in, like faith, God, heaven, hell, Satan, it's 50-50. You never can. You can't disprove it and you can't prove it. And so the way the film ends is actually kind of perfect for it because he has consequences in that technically he is guilty of a crime and he can't go back to his church and serve there anymore. But at least he's not rotting in jail. So the movie doesn't have like a, oh, everything's perfect, let's all clap and cheer ending. That's something I've always really appreciated about it. I also really love the fact that this is a PG-13 horror film that does not rely on gore. It is entirely built up around suspense, and it is filled with adult characters and adult themes. It's a very mature themed movie. Even though it's PG-13. It's one of the very few PG-13 horrors that actually does scare me because it feels realistic, it feels adult, it feels like there's real weight and dramatic implications to the things that are happening in the film. I think this is one of the better mainstream horror films of the 2000s era. I'm going to give The Exorcism of Emily Rose an A-. I've seen Scott Derrickson and his writing collaborator C. Robert Cargill talk about making more horror films in the future, and I really hope they do soon. Guys, thank you so much as always for continuing to watch the 8th annual Halloween special, and if you like this, you can click right here and get Stuckmannized.